project their voices, right? And we know how to be the giants and how to be the little mice. You really worked on pitch and range. They're going to have a lot of fun. They all look wonderful. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy the smartest giant in town. Takes 3 steps forward and says, I wish I wasn't. But one day, he noticed as he was walking a new shop. It was full of smart clothes. And he stopped by the store. He looked at the sign and he said to himself, he would really like to buy some of those. Oh, so George popped his head into the store and was greeted by 2 very poised and distinguished clerks.
Good day, George. How may I help you? You've come to the right place.
The first clerk stood up and grabbed the white shirt and said,
Shirt with very smart cufflinks. Smart pair of trousers. A smart belt. A smart straight tie. Stuff with diamonds up the sides. And a pair of shiny shoes.
George stepped behind the curtain to get dressed into his new smart clothes. Well, he's gonna be very smart in his brand new clothes. Oh, George felt wonderful and proud. He said,
Now I'm smart.
George left his old clothes behind in the shop. He was about to go home when he heard a sound. On the pavement stood a giraffe who was facing the audience and sniffling sadly. George asked,
What's the matter? My neck. It's so very long. Very long. I wish I had a long one.
George looked at her and said,
Wait.
but first he looked at her. Before he gives her the scarf, he said, the tie, he says, tells her to cheer up. And then George hands her the big stripy tie. As he does, he wraps it around and around and around and around her neck. He steps back and says, it didn't. The giraffe is so cozy in his brand new tie that he's tucking in so gently and kindly. And she says,
Thank you.
and George strode away. He sang hints to himself.
My tie is a golden giraffe. My shorts coming up and down.
George was swept right up into the story. The wind begins to blow. The goats had wished for something. We wish.
We wish we had a huge, strong sail.
So, George took off his new white shirt, went over to the mast, and tied it up. He pulls the string from that mast that's above, pull it down, and shake it a little bit. Unstick it from the tape behind, and let it go. And I'll shake it a little bit. Well, it comes down to a shirt. So anyway, he turns around and tells his friends, it made a magnificent sail. So the goats looked up, gratefully said,
Thank you.
George strode on singing to himself,
My town is
George kept on walking and came to a tiny ruined house. Beside the mouse stood a white mouse with lots of babies. They were all squeaking. One more time, they're going to squeak again and say, oh, our house.
We almost lost everything.
George put his hands on his thighs and said, what's the matter? Well, the mother mouse squeaked.
It's our house.
What happened to the house?
Burned down.
It was swept right up. Into the house. The mother mouse swept the babies out of the house. The mother mouse huddles with her babies. And now they say,
Now you know where you live.
the fire goes away. And the brother and sister mouse say, I wish. George says, George took off one of his shiny shoes and gives it to them. And he says, it was, well, the mice were so excited, they scamper around their new home. It made a perfect home for them. And George looked at them. They squeaked again and said,
Thank you.
George had to hop along now with one shoe. And as he hopped, he said,
My time is gone. My shoes, the house, the Play-Doh like mouse. Look me up and down. I'm the smartest giant in town.
George came, as he kept on walking, to a campsite. As he came to the campsite, 3 fox were standing. They stood by their tent and they were crying. George, who came down by the fire to see them in front, asked a question. question. He said,
What's the matter? It's our sleeping bag.
the fox said,
I dropped it in a puddle.
oh, they reenacted dropping in the puddle, and they wished for something. We wish, yes, they wish they had a warm, dry sleeping bag. What George says?
Cheer up.
Cheer up. And George took off, he sat down and took off his sock. And the fox snuggled into the cozy giant sock. And the giant looks at them and says, it was,
Tickling my toes anyway.
well, the fox howled and looked at him and say,
Thank you, George.
well, George continued to walk and hop away, and he was singing.
My tides got your holder, my shirt's on the boat, or a sailboard note. My shoes a hat, or a little white mouth. One of my socks is a bed for a fox. Look me up and down. I'm the smartest shouting in town.
George came to a big squelchy bog. Beside the bog stood a dog who was howling. George said,
What's the matter? It's the bog I need to get across, but I keep getting stuck in mud.
and suddenly the dog steps right into the bog and demonstrates how sticky it actually is. Oh, she looks up to George and said,
I wish I had a safe ride path. Cheer up.
and George took off his smart new belt. And as he gets it off, he added how it was pushing his.
Listen, my tummy anyway.
Well, George then laid out his giant belt across the bog. It made an excellent path for the dog to walk across. She even skipped across it. The angry dog stands up and hops across her path. And she says,
Thank you.
the wind started to blow. And George didn't mind. He was hopping along and singing to himself, my tie is a start for a cold giraffe.
My shirt's on the boat, or a sailboard boat. My shoes a house, or a little wet grass. My sock is a bed for a fox.
My belt helps a dog who was crossing the bog. But look me up and down.
I'm the smartest giant in town.
But uh-oh, he looks at me. And he says,
My shoulders fell down.
suddenly, George felt sad and shivery and not smart at all. He stood on one foot and thought,
I have to go back to the store.
and buy new clothes. He turned around and went back to the shop. When he got to the shop, though, he found that it was closed. Oh no, he cried. He sat down at the doorstep. A tear ran down his nose. He felt sad as all the animals he had met along his way home. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a bag. Something familiar was poking out on top. George took a closer look and yelled. Well, Your tie is a
scarf that holds your breath.
Your shirt's on a boat and a sail for a boat. Your shoe is a house for a little white mouse. One of your socks is a bed for a fox. Your belt has a dog who is crossing the log. So here's a very fine crown to go with your sandals and gown. To the kindest giant in town. And all the animals turn around, they look at George, they clap for George. Crisscross applesauce. What do you think?
That was just terrific. A lot of times I'll say a wrap up and I'll say